Pariyatti Audiobooks presents Chapter 10, The Great Elder, from Journey of Insight Meditation by Lerner, as read by Jonathan Nelson.
Chapter 10, The Great Elder. After 2 weeks of isolation in the forest, I left the monastery for a short time, mostly to find out about the possibility of returning to Burma. It had been rumored that tourist visas to that country were going to be extended longer than 7 days. If so, I could return there soon, and possibly stay for as long as a month. The rumors proved false, however, and I was left with a very open end to my trip. There was no particular rush to get back to Burma now, since that would probably be the last stop on my way home, and I certainly wasn't ready to return home. As I was about to leave the monastery, the American anthropologist named Michael, who'd been doing periodic fieldwork here for a year, arrived. We'd met briefly in Colombo, and it was from him that I had first learned about this forest monastery. We took an instant liking to each other, and he ended up driving me back to Colombo and putting me up at his home while I searched for a visa. After a few days in the city, though, I couldn't wait to return to the monastery. Michael noticed my haste and urged me to relax and take a trip to the interior, to Kandy, the cultural capital of Ceylon, where I might meet some of the eminent Ceylonese and Western Buddhists who often gathered there. Among the Western monks, he said, was an old German named Nyanaponika, who had come to Ceylon some 40 years ago and was one of a small group of European Buddhists long resident in Ceylon. They had founded a place called the Island Hermitage, down the coast from Colombo, a monastery devoted not only to the practice of meditation, but also to rendering into English important works of Theravada Buddhism, the branch known in the West as Hinayana, and the prevalent form of Buddhism in Southeast Asia and Ceylon. It must have been quite a time back then, Michael mused as we sat on the porch of his colonial-style home in a comfortable suburb of Colombo. The romance of it all, expatriates in yellow robes, the British Raj and exotic teachings. He put down his cold drink and described the Island Hermitage, which still functions today and is accessible only by small boat. He conjured up images of the quest, the religious journey to be free of all past conditioning, all patterns, all ties. But in recent years, Nyanaponika had retired to a more solitary situation, a place called the Forest Hermitage, located in Kandy, which was in the interior of Ceylon. You should go up to Kandy, and see Nyanaponika. He's one of the last who's left, and he's getting on in years. You can get a glimpse of what it was like. So I set out for Kandy, looking for the past and perhaps some clue to my future. On the train ride up, I read a book by Nyanaponika, which Michael gave me, The Heart of Buddhist Meditation. It enthralled me, the way a powerful novel used to. It was the first coherent description I had found in writing of what I'd been doing for months now. Kandy was a gorgeous city. The cultural heart of Ceylon lay on lush hills overlooking a large, tree-lined lake. The trees were very special, giant parasols whose span equaled their height. They leaned out uniformly from the banks far over the water. In April, at the onset of the hot season, Kandy's cool, garden-like atmosphere was a welcome contrast to the city streets of Colombo. On arriving in Kandy, I went directly to the small house at the far end of the lake that was the headquarters of the Buddhist Publication Society and of The Wheel, a small quarterly that published the writings of Nyanaponika and others. I told the gentleman in charge, Richard Abayasekiri, an elderly, white-haired Ceylonese layman of elf-like appearance, about my activities over the past few months and asked him how I might meet Nyanaponika. Richard offered to escort me the next day to the Forest Hermitage, where Nyanaponika lived. Meanwhile, he invited me to be his house guest. The next morning, just after breakfast, we set off walking through Kandy, past the enormous white Temple of the Tooth, a sacred shrine that supposedly houses an actual relic of the Buddha's body. Then we turned away from the lake along a path that led into a steep climb through the surrounding forest. The path we chose was lined with enormous mahogany trees covered with thick vines of spade-shaped, dark green leaves. The trees housed thousands of bats whose shrieks filled the forest. Richard had remarkable vigor for a man his age, and trying to keep up with him reminded me how out of shape I'd gotten sitting on my butt all these months. As I puffed up the hill, I tried to formulate the exact wording of the questions I hoped to ask Nyanaponika. Both Michael and Richard had made it clear that the old monk already had too many Westerners stopping by these days merely for social calls. He would be quite happy, though, to discuss any questions I might have about technical matters. We arrived at a neat set of small cottage-like buildings at a clearing at the top of the hill. Nyanaponika himself answered the door. He was a large, cheerful-looking man of powerful, vigorous appearance and indeterminate age. His large, bony hands looked old but strong. His face was like a baby's, though, pink with ears that jutted out, and he had an almost childlike smile and twinkling eyes of wonder. Richard briefly introduced me, and I explained my purpose, as well as what I considered my credentials in the meditation profession. This seemed to be an acceptable calling card, and we were invited in. After he and Richard had discussed some business about the next issue of the Wheel, Nyanaponika, adjusting his long, yellow robes over his shoulder, seated himself behind his desk and offered me a chair. Then, after a few brief pleasantries, he asked me just what I had in mind. Luckily, I had it all written down. For the next half hour, I phrased the questions as best I could, and Nyanaponika gave clear and detailed replies. He spoke wonderful English with a German inflection, and his long, rolling sentences were punctuated at regular intervals by "Nein?", which was not a nervous pause or even a question, but almost a metrical device to focus my attention on important points. But as he answered, and I carefully took notes, it became clear to me that I wasn't here for information, at least not this kind of information. I was here for something else. Let me know about you, Mahatera, Great Elder. Let me know about how you are, this life you lead, this wonderful existence in quiet solitude at the top of a forested hill, overlooking a lake in a beautiful tropical town. Working alone, apart from the daily drivel that I can't approach anymore. Tell me what it's like to leave your home for 40 years. That's really what I wanted to know. But instead of asking that, I filled pages of my notebook with his replies and asked more questions, getting involved in the asking because something more than the words was passing between us. I felt the tempo of our interchange pick up. Nyanaponika's wide open mind come to bear against my own, forcing it to dig deeper, to penetrate. His energy was astounding. Rigorous, German, I might have said, but as I looked at him, I didn't see a German or a European or a Ceylonese or even a Buddhist monk. He was man, free, one who had laid down all trappings, all the baggage everyone carries around to set up shop wherever he or she goes. He looked like one whose past was truly erased. Focusing on him was difficult. I looked at his face and kept seeing a baby with eyebrows bobbing excitedly as he spoke. His swaddling robes often slipped off his shoulder. "What are you doing here in Ceylon?" I felt like shouting, but I had the eerie feeling he would have shrugged and perhaps replied, "I don't know, but it's a nice place, nein?" My questioning, our conversation, was becoming personal. We weren't talking about abstractions, but about meditation and about experience. Nyanaponika explained in detail a kind of psychology that he'd outlined in his book, the process of mindfulness, the observation of the entire mind-body in its various parts. Finally, our discussion ended, and we both sat there, smiling happily. After a short pause, we began talking again, this time about books. He took me over to his shelves, which held an enormous range of literature, philosophy, and religion. Science fiction, humanistic psychology, and Buddhist texts sat side by side. He kept showing me facets, new sides, new avenues of knowledge he'd explored, new means of expression. He wasn't only a scholar, but a poet as well, as his marvelous translations of Buddhist text showed. When he finally saw me to the door, he asked me how long I'd be in Kandy, and whether I might want to return to visit him. Outside the doorway, other visitors were waiting, a professor of Indian studies from Yale and his wife. They had been waiting out there for some time. Nyanaponika apologized to them for the delay and smiled at me again. I told him I'd surely be back, and asked if the day after next would be too soon. He smiled and seemed almost as glad as I. Richard seemed to work at his job 365 days a year, and I don't know how many hours a day. He was usually still at his desk when I went to sleep. I helped him a little, proofreading galleys, but much of my time I kept wandering around his library, opening books that led me to other books, that led me back to my notebook to jot down questions for my next meeting with Nyanaponika. At other times, I went by myself for long walks into town for dinner, which Richard did without, or just around the lake. I spent a lot of time beside the lake, trying to piece together the fragments of recent experiences, feeling them all pointing in a single direction. Richard was fond of telling me stories of Nyanaponika's younger days, when he was just one of a group of disciples gathered around Nyanathilaka, the German monk who founded the island hermitage. The stories encompassed all the details of romantic adventure, exotic locales, powerful personages, and even tragic lives. But the real adventure, at least to me, was the abandonment of everything familiar in one's life to take up the single task of seeking enlightenment. Richard's stories only rekindled within me a growing fascination for this ultimate adventure. During the last few days before I left the monastery, I had spent some time with the two English-speaking monks, Suno and Ratanapala, at their quarters, the meditation section of the complex, where a number of bhikkhus lived in seclusion to pursue more intensive practice. I had gotten quite close to both of them over numerous cups of afternoon tea. Now, one brief incident stuck in my mind. Ratanapala was an intense, dark man of about 40, with jet black eyes and a constant, bristly stubble of beard, who had only been a monk some 3 years after managing his father's exporting business in Colombo. When we talked of his life, he said it had only one purpose: to achieve some sort of freedom, some taste of freedom in this lifetime. Nothing outside these walls was of interest to him anymore. For 3 years, he said, I've been in this place and never gone outside it. And I won't, he added, until I die. As I listened to Richard now, I was only reminded of the seemingly unbridgeable gap between what these men as monks had left behind and the life they were pursuing now. And here I was, trying to keep one foot on both sides of the chasm. It was getting uncomfortable. My discomfort had become apparent to me immediately on leaving the monastery with Michael, when we stopped for a day and a night at a beautiful house on the beach, rented by 2 friends of his, a Western couple. It was a very worldly household, complete with balky servants, lovely food, sick pet animals, fine swimming, car repairs, good beer, and marital squabbles. It was all perfectly familiar to me, while at the same time disturbingly alien. I understood what Ratanapala meant. All my life, the mundane details of daily existence on the planet had always been an imposition, an unwanted intrusion on something else, something more important, even when I'd never been able to identify what really was more important. Now it seemed I had. It couldn't be clearer. And more importantly, here was an actual working model, a way of life which men were living, where those details and consuming diversions didn't exist. Renunciation, something that isn't undertaken lightly. At some moments, it seemed totally unthinkable, just too distant from who I was and what I wanted and what I would have to leave behind. And in other moments, I was already there. I was the monk Ratanapala, happy to give up the past forever. But could I do it? Only I would know, surely. But somehow I looked to these men, particularly Nyanaponika, for some clue. In preparation for my next meeting with Nyanaponika, I had begun reading some pretty interesting books on the Theravada tradition, the school of Buddhism which traces its lineage back to the original sermons of the Buddha. Along the way, it has developed perhaps the most detailed maps of spiritual development ever conceived, describing a topography of the mind that is at first incomprehensible to a Westerner. Enormous manuals of psychology dissect such phenomena as moments of consciousness, stages of mental purification, components of various mind states, and every single step from here to enlightenment. Wading through these texts, I was startled to find very detailed descriptions of mind states that corresponded to my actual experiences. I was eager to pinpoint where I was on this map, but the basic compass points were not entirely clear to me. Nirvana was the goal, I assumed. But the texts talked of it as if it was two different things, a final, absolute release from suffering and rebirth, and a momentary experience, a contact with that holy other state right here in this life. Was that what I had experienced that day in my hut? That instant of stillness that had so blasted me apart for days after? Was that moment nirvana? And if it was, where was it on this map of enlightenment? It was evening, and I was sitting in Richard's office poring over more books when the old monk came in unexpectedly. He had walked all the way down the hill to discuss the cover for a forthcoming issue of The Wheel. I smiled politely when he entered and tried to continue reading. When he was about to leave, he asked if I would like to accompany him at least part of the way on his walk back. I quickly followed him, but I was nervous because I hadn't fully formulated my questions. I tried to explain them as we walked, but he didn't seem to be listening. He was too busy pointing out the sights and landmarks. We took a detour to the back of the Temple of the Tooth, where he showed me a very ancient building and explained its history and style of architecture. What about nirvana? I wanted to blurt out, but he seemed perfectly satisfied that our walk should be taken up with matter-of-fact conversation. He took joyous interest in everything that passed before him. I asked him to tell me a little about his own life, and he talked of how he had come to read some books in Germany and then decided to come here. Not why or how, just that he ended up here. Then he spoke glowingly about the old days at the island hermitage, the days when there were quite a few monks, all embarking on their unique path. I asked if he went back there anymore. No, he said. It is finished now for me. I spend most of my time up here. There are still plenty of monks there now, but no strong personalities there anymore. He seemed to say that, at least for him, the grand adventure was over. There aren't many foreign monks in Ceylon anymore, he commented without saying why. I had a real sense of having come in on the tail end, the last chapter of a great story. But I knew that he would never say that. For him, it was just another day now. Things just happened to be different. He went on with his work and was not concerned about his age or the future, while I, it seemed, had an entire lifetime ahead of me to worry about. What would I do with it? What should I do with it? I wanted to ask, but didn't know how. Can I really live like you? Or Bhikkhu Sunno or Bhikkhu Ratanapala? That was the question that I really needed an answer to. We were getting pretty far up the hill. The sun was almost setting and I'd have to turn back soon. I hadn't yet asked what I really wanted to. Finally, I said, "Would you mind very much if I ask you some questions about my own meditation? You see, it's been a while since I've been with a teacher, and a lot of things have been happening, and maybe you could help me to understand them." "All right," he said rather carefully, "if it's possible." Then I went on to describe my meditation practice, and that one particular event in the forest hut. It was confusing, I said, because I was having trouble correlating my own experience with the technical descriptions I had read. Tell me, I was trying to say, what I have experienced. He responded by saying that one had to be careful of what one read and heard. The most important thing in this meditation practice was always to remain critical, absolutely critical of whatever you experienced. Whatever the state of consciousness I experienced was, I should at least take it as an encouraging sign, as a hint of what lay beyond, and continue on. I thought about this for a moment in silence. Nyanaponika very matter-of-factly remarked that it was time for me to turn back, or it would be too dark to find my way down the hill. It was only as I walked alone through the forest dusk that I realized how understated the monk had made his goodbye. The non-committal nature of his answer to my question didn't really upset me. I knew as I walked back down the hills alone that I wanted all kinds of advice and judgment from him. I wanted to hear, "This is the life, the way, the path, follow it." But none of it was that clear, ever. I'd be lucky to make it down the hill before dark. I'd come here for a day or two, reluctantly. When Richard woke me early the next morning, in time to make the first train back to Colombo, I had no real idea why I was leaving so soon. It had been my plan, of course, and I wanted to return to the intensive practice in the monastery. But at the same time, I could have stayed in Kandy, earning my keep, perhaps by helping Richard with his publications. When I went into the kitchen with my bags packed, Richard had breakfast prepared for me. I felt as if I was leaving a dear friend I had known for a lifetime. I felt my whole life accelerating, without my will or control. I felt more confident than ever of its direction, but all the time there was less and less to hold on to, less and less to be sure of.
Pariyatti, a nonprofit 501c3 organization, offers a wide variety of books, eBooks, videos, and audiobooks about the teachings of the Buddha, the Pāli language, and Vipassana meditation. Browse our complete catalog at www.pariyatti.org.